Thank you, Ben. It's great to be with the 1455 Summer Festival and good to be back together with my good friend, E. Ethelbert Miller. I'm Tim Wendel. I'm a writer in residence at Johns Hopkins, author of 14 books. It keeps me off the streets, several of which have been about baseball, Castros curveball, summer of 68 high heat, and the latest escape from Castros, Cuba. And I'm joined, as I said, by my good friend E. Ethelbert Miller. The man is a tour de force, poet, teacher, literary activist. He's based in Washington, D.C. He's the author of several collections of poetry, 2 memoirs. You know, I thought one life would do a memoir, but and the host of the weekly WPFW morning radio show On the Margin, highly recommended. His latest book of poems, When Your Wife Has Tommy John Surgery. Well, you always want to avoid this. This is due out in the fall, right?
Right.
All right. So what we're doing today, the way this is built, and this might just work. It's a game in a sense of catch. So we're out in the backyard throwing that ball around. Here's one.
Sticky ball, Tim, the sticky ball.
Yeah, I'm trying to get all the sticky stuff off me, you know. Every now and then we'll be lobbing some questions. We'll be firing some too. Regrettably, sometimes we'll miss the ball and it'll roll into the tall grass, but we promise to retrieve it very, very quickly and keep things moving ahead. So Ethelbert, let's get things rolling. You once said, and this has stuck with me, baseball can teach us 2 important lessons. There's probably more, but about patience and surprise. Can you tease those out just a little bit?
Well, you know, when you go to a game, let's begin with the surprise. You know, if we were around in 1938, we would be surprised that Johnny Vandermeer would pitch 2 consecutive no-hitters. Okay, you just don't expect that, and I think that's a surprise. I always think, for example, during the World Series, somebody who maybe was hitting 232 or whatever wound up being a hero. But almost on every pitch in a baseball game, you never know what's going to happen, and this is why one of the rule changes that I sort of dislike was the one where you would have the intentional walk and the pitcher actually had to throw to the catcher. You think that's an automatic toss, but you could be surprised if the pitcher just overthrows the catcher. And so I think that's one of the things I like about baseball. In terms of patience, I look at the fact that, we live in a time when everything's moving fast. We're trying even to speed up the game. And I like the fact that baseball is sort of meditative in between pitches, in between innings. And that's what I take away from it, especially as I'm getting older. I don't want to speed everything
up. Speed things up too much, we'll be done before we know it.
Right.
Well, what you're talking about reminds me of my mom, for example. And I think family and the game is very important. I think it needs to be handed down, parent to kid type of thing. But my mom did not grow up a very big baseball fan. And I finally took her to a game. Well, this is only about 15, 17 years ago, up in Buffalo, near where I grew up, and the nice new ballpark there. And she knew football. She was from Michigan, so she had gone to the University of Michigan. She had, she knew hockey because we used to have season tickets, so, basketball even. And I took her, and it was several of us, and we're doing like what we're doing now. We're kind of half watching the game, we're talking, but she's intent. I mean, she's just focused in. And it wasn't until about the 2nd or 3rd inning, she finally leans back, she almost kind of relaxed as he said, I get it now. And I'm going, okay, Mom, what do you get? I don't know. And she said, this is what baseball is. We're sitting around watching this game and we're talking, we're catching up. Sometimes we're looking at the game. Other times I'm looking at you and we're just having a conversation like we are today. And
but it's interesting, Tim, that you say that with that conversation that you have with your mother at an actual game, because that's something I never experienced. I never went to a game with my mother or father. They were not sports people. My mother knew one person playing baseball, and that was Jackie Robinson. And I don't think she knew what position he played, but she knew he was on the Dodgers, But the whole thing, when you mentioned that, I think that's the joy, even like this playing catch, you think of playing catch with your father. I like the fact that you mentioned, okay, here's how I interacted with the game with my mother.
Yeah, very much. Well, I think the game, and I want to filter into this, but it's obviously impacted our writing. I mean, we come back to it a fair amount. It's impacted our lives and such. And what were your, you mentioned your mom, Jackie Robinson, so probably your household, the Dodgers were pretty important. I had the other, major players that resonated with you or the family and teams and such?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that question, Tim, and I thought about how your work affected me. And so when I was interviewing you for your book on Cancer Crossing, and you were talking about how you began to, you want to write the story. It wasn't until you looked at these doctors doing cancer research as a team that you were able to bring your expertise into writing this next book, which was not a baseball book. And I said, wow, that's something in terms of how the game that's so special to you winds up being almost like a tool or something that you can rely on. And I felt that was extremely important.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, it's funny because I think maybe it's because of baseball or maybe sports in general. When I'm starting a project, I tend to I'm always fascinated by organizations and teams and how they sometimes work together and other times are kind of dysfunctional. And, you hear at times saying, well, team chemistry, it's overblown. I don't think so. And and it's regardless of sport. So when I was originally doing, say, Cancer Crossings, yeah, I'm in over my head. We're talking medicine stuff and we got these swirl doctors. But when I could start seeing how well they could work together or the times they didn't, then it started to play out to a certain degree. It's funny, we're bringing up family and such, and I just flashed on that same ballpark roughly in Buffalo. I grew up outside of Buffalo. So if anybody's seen The Natural, you've seen my past.
With the flashing bulbs and stuff too.
Yeah, flashing balls, all that stuff. But the stadium where they played is actually the stadium my grandfather, took me to my first couple games. It was the old rock pile, it was called, in Buffalo. And so I always see The Natural as, that's where we used to go for games. They didn't have exploding, lights and such like that. At least I miss those games. Right. But again, it's kind of handed down, and I think as I grow older now, fondly about those times, and I wish I'd paid a little bit more attention to what my grandfather was telling me about the game, and how to follow it. Because you're absolutely right. It's very much like writing at times, because things kind of build up. And then you're waiting, what's next? Right. What's the surprise?
And you said something, Tim, that's very important, in terms of how sometimes we're introduced to the game. You went immediately to a ballpark, the same way I'm certain that some kids went immediately to like Fenway Park. And for me, it was Yankee Stadium. And I think for many young people, and I saw this with my godchild when I took him to his first game, when you go into that park and it's a complete experience, the smell of food, and then you see the outfield and the infield. It's something that you remember, and especially if, for example, you're with a person that you love, your father, or in the case, or a best friend. You remember that moment.
Yeah, the greenest grass still I've ever seen. It's the first time you walk into a ballpark and you go, how can grass be that green? Right. So your favorite team, the Yankees?
Right? I grew up with the Yankees. This is occurring. This talk is occurring after the Padres beat the Nats by 24 runs. But I still
they needed us pitching the other night.
Right. But you know what happens when you talk about where a person's from, and I think sometimes you see this when you're in college. People identify their city with the sports team, especially if the team is winning. Or the team has a great player. I'm certain that a lot of people, identify with the Mets when the Mets won the World Series. I remember I was at college and everybody was from New York, even though they were from Long Island someplace, but they all felt like they were New Yorkers. And I think that that's very important, that sense of place. And I think that's something we should not overlook.
Oh, very much. I think the place, and especially early on as it happens. It's funny, you bring up the Yankees, and this might be the end of our friendship after this, but I grew up a Red Sox fan. But
that is the end of our friendship right there.
Yeah, that's done. Okay, turn it off. But I grew up a Red Sox fan because I didn't get to Boston, I don't think, for the first time until I was 20. So it wasn't like the Red Sox were my local team, and anybody knows their geography. Boston's a long way away from Buffalo, New York. But that was the team when I tried out for Little League that I was assigned to. And I even wrote an essay years later that I'm going to find that adult supervisor because he cursed me forever after they blew it, like, 67, 86, on and on. I felt like I was just scarred. And I still remember my brother, who actually grew up a Tiger fan, because he was on that team and actually spent more time up in Michigan with my mom's side of the family and grew up a Tiger fan. When the Red Sox were about ready to win it, finally, and I get a call from him, and it was like late at night. It was like 11:45, 11:50, and I pick up, go, oh, and it's my brother Chris, who my son's named after, and and all he says was, and I could see somewhat from that was him, from the the caller ID, but all he says is, "You're dreaming."
But Tim, you mentioned me, social media with the Yankees. As a writer, in terms of sound, the Red Sox, I think, also influenced me. Even before I decided to become a writer, I remember names like Bill Mambuquette, Tony Cogliano, Carly Yastrzemski. Those were names that, just the sound of it was very important to me. And I remember my friend Robert Pinsky, who lives up in New England, when he was the poet laureate of the United States. He gave a talk here in DC, and he was talking about how he got into poetry. And it was the sound of the stations, like in New Jersey, when you on the train, it says Hoboken, Teaneck, and I said, okay, Bill Mambuquette, and I think for writers, that sound, whether it's ball players, countries, singers, the name, Nat King Cole, I think is very important, just the sound.
Yeah, and it was something that's going to stick with you and still rattle around. It's funny, I haven't thought about Tony Conigliaro now in years, and now I won't be able to get him out of my mind.
Yeah.
So,
and when you think about him, there's a number of things when we talk about baseball. We talk about the tragedies, whether it's Herb Score getting hit, whether it's Tony getting hit in the head. We realize the game is much safer, and thank God for that, because guys are throwing 100 miles. I mean, the only player I remember on the Yankees that you were scared of was Ryan Duran, who had these glasses and bad eyesight, and you wanted to make sure he knew where the plate was. But these tragedies are ones that stick in your mind, and also ones that made the game safer. We can think about this recently, the putting up of netting to protect the fans from bats and balls, and we realize when we see some of these players, like hitting the ball so fast that we can actually measure. You don't want a child to get hit in the head with that.
No, not at all. And it's funny, you're bringing up health and such, and one of the, sometimes just that overlap, or trying the concern of health or injuries or whatever it may be. When I was doing, I just brought to mind, when I was doing high heat, where I went in search of the fastest pitcher of all time, which you can't really judge, but it was a lot of fun. Went around the country, all this. And one of the guys I ended up talking with was Bob Feller, and who is was kind of a crusty guy.
Bullet Bob Feller, right?
Yeah, Bob, and he was very at times dismissive of the current generation of players. I mean, we get into that too. But at that point, Tim Lincecum, who was pitching for the Giants in San Francisco, had hair kind of here, shorter than me, liked to skateboard, this type of thing. And in fact, I remember coming into the Giants clubhouse, or trying to get in it one time, walking with him, and the guard wouldn't let him in because he didn't look like a baseball player.
Right.
But anyway, I'm talking with Feller, and Feller had this saying. Feller said he never iced his arm. He felt everybody was babied too much. And his saying about ice was, ice is for drinks.
So I remember that.
And I'm talking with him, and I go, there's a guy pitching right now who doesn't ice his arm. And he's like, what? And it's Lincecum. Lincecum didn't really ice his arm. And so somehow I was able to get the two of them together. And I heard the last year of Feller's life, he was chatting, calling Lincecum half the time. And that is one odd couple. I mean, you talk about Bob Feller and Tim Lincecum, and yet here they are chatting about baseball's the thing that brings them together. So right. It's fun.
When you mention those type of names of individual Feller, the one that I was introduced to as a young child, who became famous for his writing, is Jim Bowden. And he was so nice to us kids outside Yankee Stadium, because at that time, the players were encouraged to interact with the fans. So the Yankees came into the ballpark the same way they dominated the American League. Mickey Mantle, Roger, they would just push the little kids away like they were like, the Kansas City Athletics. But Jim Bowden would line us up and sign our gloves, and he was always very, very nice. And we would go back to, like, I grew up in the housing project. We would go back to the housing project, put our hats on our heads, so that when we threw the ball, it would fall off like Jim Bullock. We just like how his hat fell off, And so when you're a kid, remember that. But when you mention names like Feller and others, and you have to get a chance to talk with them, those are the other things that I guess goes on to make you, like, for yourself, a sports writer. You're that interacting with players, and you realize these are people who are like the workers.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, again, you learn, I think, to listen a little bit. Some of the players are like, the mantles or whatever of your youth. I mean, especially if you're a sports writer, as I was on the beat for many years, they don't want anything to do with you.
Right.
But it's funny, I was thinking the other day, because I was talking about the steroid era with somebody and such. And during that point in '96, when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, are having the great home run derby, in a sense, for the season, I went down and visited with Hank Aaron. And Hank had, he gave me time. We had a gracious conversation. I kept the tape for many years. And when I went back and heard the tape, and this is where I wish I was listening a little bit more, he kept saying, it makes you wonder why they feel they need to hit the ball so hard. A home run for me, it goes 3 or 4 rows into the stands, it's still a home run. They're hitting them into the upper deck. It makes you wonder why they have to hit them so hard. He was trying to give me a heads up that things weren't on the up and up when it came to performance enhancing and this type of thing. But
I'm glad you mentioned Hank Aaron, because this past week we had the AllStar Game. It was nice to see his wife, I think Billy Aaron, walk out, because when I saw her and I called my wife and said, "Oh, come see Mrs. Aaron," I realized also a woman that I really admire, which is Rachel Robinson, and you realize that Rachel Robinson, really, these women were responsible for their men surviving as men and as baseball players. I think of Rachel Robinson in terms of one, knowing that Jackie Robinson had a temper, and I couldn't imagine him coming back to a room or something by him, and it was just him. There has to be somebody there to make him forget about what happened outside. And so, when we think about these sports, sometimes, like we looked at how this past week there's female announcers in the booth, but there's the other women, who made it possible for these men to survive. And I think that's something where, they need their own Hall of Fame, perhaps, because they're very important.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I totally agree. All right. If somebody's just tuning in, they're going, wow, Tim and Ethelbert just having a big love fest about baseball. I mean, but there's some problems, and somebody's going to chime in about launch angles or spin rates or maybe some sticky substances or something. How do you assess the state of the national pastime right now?
Well, I think what happens, we could look at it in terms of what's happening politically. Okay, we are existing, in terms of looking at who won the election, the vote count, looking at the numbers, the recall. I mean, so you can see that. And that's something that we saw coming into our lives, into our thinking, numbers. Okay, where, for example, that's a way of analyzing something. The same way today, young people grow up. Okay, how many hits, numbers do I have in terms of Instagram or Facebook? And that type of thing, is what I feel has really hurt the game. But it's also part of our technology, the ability to capture the data. You might recall, we grew up when, I grew up on an abacus, little abacus, what I'm saying? That's what I knew I wasn't going for. That's when I said, okay, if I can't get the abacus, I'm never going to deal with the slide rule. But it was always these numbers, and when you think about it in terms of baseball, there's numbers. It's like 56, Joe DiMaggio, 61, Roger Maris, 60. We're into numbers. And that was just, numbers of statistics. But now, because you are fascinated by numbers and you can monitor everything. It's not just numbers, it's graphs, where you can see. And this is where what happens is that if we permit that, to come into the game, we're taking away the human factor. But let's look at what we also see in terms of the changing of the game. Steph Curry, there was a point when Steph Curry was peaking that, if he missed a free throw, the fan was like, what happened? He was like Robo Curry, he was like some sort of, robot, because it was so automatic. But there's something where, you realize that's the practice. But the same way he's changed the launch angles, because keep in mind, he's shooting threes from where out, from half the court. That sort of looking at the data, the shooting, that comes into baseball. Okay, that comes into baseball. So you look at all the things, football, the Olympics, all these things, data is driving it. Okay, if you were having a problem trying to be on a swim team or something like that, your swim coach would give you data. How fast the water's going over your hat or something like that. And this is something where, and I'll mention this, and you might want to pick up on it. The whole idea of having some sort of, robotic calling, balls and strikes is totally ridiculous. And this gets back into what I titled my book, If God Invented Baseball. Well, man invented baseball. We're not perfect. Okay, so I don't really care if the second baseman on the shortstop missed second base during the double play. It looked nice, it looked nice. This is why I hate instant replay. The play looks beautiful, so what happened? You slid off the bag and the guy kept the glove on you, and so you're out. No, you stole the bag. That's like by stealing, and then, all of a sudden the die explodes, and they call you out.
Well, I agree. There's been too much emphasis on data. And one of the reasons I worry about too much data is it can kind of make the story more convoluted, or, I don't know, dazed out, or, destroyed in some ways. And I'm thinking of my friend, Billy Wagner, who pitched for many years in the major leagues, great reliever. And I love his story for a couple of reasons. Number one, he was originally a right-hander and then broke his arm, his wrist, and suddenly started throwing with his left and arm, and became so fast. But he tells an amazing story where his coach, this is in college, and his coach is kind of doing an analysis of him and saying, well, you're pitching, your fastballs are roughly, I think at that point, like 89, 90 miles an hour. That's good, but it's not great. And it'll be good for this level, but after this, you better start figuring out something else to do. And Wagner talks about thinking about that for a couple weeks. And, he's doing some different things with his motion, but he's mostly thinking about it. He's not dwelled on the data that much. And somehow within a month, he picked up like 4 to 5 miles per hour on his fastball. And to this day, he goes, don't try to explain it to me. I don't try to explain it to myself. It's part of my story. It's what happened to me. I needed to kind of step up, and somehow, the energy, whatever, it started to flow through me. And the data's not going to compute that.
Sure.
So it's kind of.
But the data also is what we begin to crunch those numbers when we decide, okay, who should be permitted into the Hall of Fame? Yeah. Because one could say that those numbers are kind of low for some of these people who we are admitting into the Hall of Fame. So, and then also with the numbers, we now have a new issue in terms of, adding the statistics from the Negro Baseball League.
Yes. And what those are getting added in. I think it's about time. It should have been done many, many decades ago, but it's interesting how it's going to be kind of computed out. Okay, you've come out against automated strike zone. I knew that was coming. How about some of the other things that are...
Well, I think let's look at this. The whole thing of the sticky stuff. Okay, so what happens? Okay, say somebody is using, the umpires are stopping. They don't have any gloves. You know what I mean? If I was the umpire, union and whatever, I'm like, say, okay, what am I sticking my hands in? If you move that to the medical profession, it's not healthy.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what happens is that I always felt, if you're not checking a catcher's shin guard, who could put some on and throw, it makes no sense. And then the beauty of it is this. So you are able to make the ball spin rotation change. Well, that's beautiful. Okay, do you really need a sticky stuff if you had a whole bunch of knuckleball pitches? No. Okay, and then what you did see, and more stuff will come out, because the problem of this is they did this in the middle of the season.
Yeah.
The problem that you can see, okay, is that there are some players playing in GC with the humidity that you can't get a grip.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so all of a sudden now, I mean, I can't control my curveball and it's hitting somebody in the head. If this was an Amazon factory or Walmart factory, we have some problem about the workers. You know, I'm saying I'm not gonna work in Amazon if the ball is thrown at my head. You know, and I just say that, you know, in terms of one, we saw during the pandemic, there were many people concerned about the conditions, their working conditions, and we have to look at the baseball players, the ballpark, as a place where they work. Mm-hmm. And then there's the beauty. So, okay, so somebody knows how to scruff the ball and give it a spin. That's a skill. Mm-hmm. That's no different than Trump cheating on his taxes. Don't everybody do it? I mean, and this is why you look up, there's a lot of rappers who, you know, you look up, they like Donald Trump because Donald Trump knows how to get over it, right? So if you are able to spike the ball, you know, put a little thing on the ball, make the ball, yeah, somebody said, man, how can I do that? And what happens, there are secrets of the game. Yeah. And that's part of the game. And so what happens, if you're a really professional hitter, what do they tell you? You might get me out the first time, but the second time I make the adjustment if I'm a good hitter.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just afraid if they try to inspect Max Scherzer again, it's going to look like some bad burlesque show, but right. That's me. Let's do a pause. I'd love to hear a poem from you, my friend.
I'll read a poem that captures, I'll capture.
Yes, Max Scherzer.
No, where we are today, I'll read the two pandemic poems. You know, I like this first one. And I'm saying this, I like this first one because I read it over again after it published. The cardboard season of 2020, the summer of Black Lives Matter. We looked around the empty ballparks, staring at black cardboard faces, wondering who decided where to place us. You know, this is very important because, you know, with issues of diversity coming up, there's probably some ballparks that probably put more cardboard black people than they actually had in the regular season.
They ever had in their own.
They never had them, you know. And then where do you put them? Put them in the bleachers, you know. And it's just, I just had that. And then the second one is the one that ends the book, and I think it's very important because it has a lot to do then with our pastime and what it means for our country, you know, coming out of the pandemic. When the gains return, we will not hide behind the mask. We will race out onto the field to bask in fellowship and embrace the sky, sun, and the four bases below. There will be no fear in the air, no sickness in the stands. There will only be cheering and clapping and a knowing that baseball is what matters and our dreams are round and hard and at times get caught in our gloves. When the tarp is lifted and rolled back, a sudden beauty will appear. It will be the memories of what we missed and what we love. It will be baseball. It will be prayer.
Ah, that's beautiful. All right, folks, get those poetry collections. This man's good.
Well, now you, Tim, you have to read because Cuba's in the news.
There's so much in the news, it's nuts.
So I want you to lift the embargo so we can hear.
I'm trying to lift the embargo, but it's heavy lifting right now, my friend. Well, you know, we'll return to this, I think, a little bit, because one thing I love about writing baseball, you know, and I like writing a lot of things, but baseball can really, you know, get to be one-on-ones very quickly. Right. You know, the obvious one is the pitcher versus the batter, which I'll read from here in a minute. And but you also got the ball versus the fielder, you know, even the fans, you know, versus, you know, what they're trying to, you know, who they're cheering for or whatever. This is from my very first novel, Castros Curveball. And it's just a short thing. And
Can I see that again? That's a new cover.
That is a new cover.
Let me see. That looks nice.
Yeah, that's now out with Nebraska Press.
Yeah, it's a nice cover.
Yeah, what could have been if Fidel Castro had embraced baseball a little bit more than revolution. But this is from her very early on. And my old friend, Alan Schuss,
Oh, Allen, yeah. I
You
love
got to
that.
build to something here. Again, a one-on-one. We still need to see some opposition. So this is very early on, and the narrator is Billy Bryan, the sometime Washington senator catcher who's down in Cuba. This is taking place in Havana, and this student protester has taken the mound, and he's suddenly uncorks this amazing pitch with a guy named Rory Guild is the batter, an American. And this is Billy telling us the story. When he let the ball go, I could tell by the rotation that it was going to be a beauty. The curveball came in like it was heading for Guild's head and shoulders, but it had plenty of bite. I could sense Guild's knees begin to buckle. He was a goner on this one. I'm convinced there are moments when time does slow down, as if the gods themselves can't believe what they're seeing and make the world pause a beat or two so they can all gather round and get a better look. As soon as that ball started to break, I was silently rooting it home. All Guild could do was watch that pitch break beautifully down and over the inside corner and into my glove. The pitch must have broken almost 3 feet, and I never had to move to catch it. When the ball fell into my glove like a feather dropped from above, the first thing that came into my head was a question. How could this Cuban kid deliver such a great pitch when we had yahoos with years of instruction in the minor leagues who would never come close to throwing a ball this well? Strike 3, the umpire shouted, and the crowd went crazy. And of course, that student protester is a young Fidel Castro. And
I would like to ask you a question, Tim. That's
Sure.
the young Fidel Castro. I wonder, based on, looking back over the years, who do you feel was some of the best curveball pitchers? Because you were talking about like high heat, the fastball pitchers.
Sure.
We can this, but who do you think had the best curveball?
Oh, I think Koufax is right up there.
Sandy, yeah.
Yeah, some of the conversations I've had, and I think we, it wasn't so much a rule change, but I think it was a perception change. And I remember talking with Nolan Ryan about this a little bit because he had a pretty good curveball, but he felt that it wasn't being called as a strike. It was breaking too much up, down. And so therefore he adjusted the grip and in a way had to kind of tone down that gift. I mean, you always think of Ryan as a fastball pitcher, and certainly he was, but he had a great kind of 12-6 break for a while with his curveball. And that's because he couldn't get it called for a strike. So here we have something beautiful, and yet everyone's going, no, that's not a strike. And the adjustments are going to be made. Sometimes.
I'm glad when you talk about adjustment, coach, and you mentioned Koufax, because I do recall me, like a Yankee fan, that the first time the Yankees met Koufax in the World Series, Mickey Mantle goes back, like, how are we supposed to hit this? I think he must have struck out 5 in a row, something like that. But Mickey Mantle goes back to the dugout, like, how are we supposed to hit this? But I also think of, I think it's Camilo Pascual.
Oh yeah, very much.
Curveball,
yeah.
And then I think Brett Blyleven.
Yeah, Blyleven had a good one. And Blyleven, it's funny, we're bringing up a little bit of Hall of Fame. I was on the Veterans Committee in 2015, 2016. We didn't elect anybody in, but
that was you.
Yeah, it was me. They tried to elect me in. No, I was trying to. That's all off the record. I can't really speak.
Okay.
The guy who was sitting next to half the time was Bert Blyleven. It has to be one of the funniest. He was, one of the funniest guys in the world, and a lot of interesting people on that. Phil Necro, Pat Gillick, and Bobby Cox. It was an interesting couple days. So, well, let's step back a bit. Now, one of the things, and sometimes it's a burden, sometimes I think it's a great gift. And you brought up Jackie Robinson. I'm thinking of 68. A book I did summer '68. Even think, after the Yankees, winning after 9/11. What I'm bringing up is baseball's always kind of there, and baseball is like a part of our history. It's a part of even current events, and the nation's at another crucial crossroads, you could say. What's baseball got to say about this, or how do you think baseball's gonna?
I look at one of the players that we saw, especially during the AllStar Game. One person that's really dominated our interpretation of baseball on a number of levels, and that's Shohei Ohtani. Showtime. While he is having this phenomenal season, pitching and hitting, if you are an older Asian American in New York or San Francisco, you're afraid to go out.
Yeah.
You know, you're afraid of being attacked. And I say that because we could talk about Jackie Robinson, you know, breaking color. Yeah, and the segregation, you know, is going on. You know, it's Emmett Till is going on, okay? And so what happens is that we really need to make sure that when we go to the ballpark, we don't go to escape, okay? You know, like how we go to the movie theater. But we realize that this pastime, if it's going to be the American pastime, it has to be one in which there is equality in terms of people playing. And what happens if we are to learn from baseball, then we take the lessons from the ballpark back out into the general community. Keep in mind, it was just a few years ago, well, we thought Japanese were too small to play baseball. Even Ichiro, which was one of my favorite players, you know, because he was a position player. And I think if you go back and you know, when he first was with the, you know, breaking in, he was like, oh, like this guy, and then you look up, you know, he's gonna be the first Japanese person into the AllStar Game. But I say that because we sometimes highlight individuals, but don't want to connect them to anything. And so I felt, you know, I want to connect this achievement because there are other Asian Americans who are doing great things who are afraid to go out. Okay, and that needs to be highlighted. The other thing that needs to be looked at was, and this goes with Shohei Ohtani, why does he, you know, so Babe Ruth had to make a decision. Why can't Ohtani do both? Okay, you know, the same way I think this person said, like, yeah, you know, like, you know, no one could imagine to box like Muhammad Ali boxed until they saw Muhammad Ali box. You know, then, oh, you can box like that, right? Yeah, well, you can play this, you know, or like, you know, and you probably know the guy that he was arguing with, but you remember there's a big, with Tim McCarr that had some problem with Deion Sanders. And Deion Sanders was, I think, went to the World Series, then left, took a play, and ran the ball back with a kickoff 100 yards. And that was like, oh no, this is bad, because this makes spring training and summer preparation pushes it out the door. I really don't have to be doing all this if I can just get off a plane and run it back. Why are we lifting weights and working out? I say that because these individuals, you know, we try to look at them a certain way. And I'll end on this note, Tim, answering your question about this. Go back to the All-Star Game and listen to how many times, and both announcers are white, look at how many times they talk about how the various players, who are usually players of color, including Ohtani, have a smile, okay? Have a smile. It is pushing that smile image of players of color that also creates a problem when the players don't want to smile or they want to deal with issues of social justice, okay? I maintain that when we talk about smiles and images, we go back to Frederick Douglass, who was one of the most photographed individuals when photography came out, okay? And when the camera was, the most photographed person is Frederick Douglass, and you will never, ever, ever see a picture of Frederick Douglass smiling, and he did that deliberately. Because he knew he represents almost a modern man. I'm not going to give you any image that connects me to slavery.
Yeah.
Okay? And I think this is very important, and it might have to be where the announcers have to change, because you know what happens if you do football. If you take people know that the player is a person of color just by how they talk about it. Does anybody talk about how fast Tom Brady runs? It's a natural ability, you know? And then this whole thing about, like pitching the quarterback, and I just had to tell somebody, the most important person on a football field is a center. How many black centers do you know?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, okay, you want to market the quarterback, but the most important, if you want to say the brains of it's a center. And there are not that many black centers.
Yeah, good point. And I think, it's funny, you bring up All-Star Game and with Ohtani, and, I tuned in Home Run Derby, and I covered those for several years, and those are nuts to write about. You just go, what the heck are we going to write about here? But, and then, he loses to Soto in that first round, which was epic. Right. And at first I went, oh, well, there's a failure. There's showtime, I mean, that's, whatever. But just the way, it wasn't so much smile, and we had certainly the language situation going on, but just the way Ohtani carried himself, within just, I completely flipped in about 10, 15 minutes. And somebody wrote about it the next day. the night was his, even though he never got out of the first round. And it was just the way, he was like, he's gracious, but he got the magnitude of what he was trying to do. It didn't work out. Okay. And I thought, and especially with him using, an interpreter, which I guess he had been criticized for only a couple of days before, I thought it was an amazing night. And you bring up a special point, and baseball always ends up in these situations somehow. Here we've got, as you say, Asian Americans, many fearing for their lives in a way, simply because of all the junk that's out there right now. And yet here we are, you tune in that night, the biggest event going, and you've got this guy who some could perceive as a loser, but he wasn't.
Yeah. I'm glad you said it. Let's look at some big issues. Okay, let's look at the AllStar Game.
Sure.
So baseball will get credit for taking a political decision and moving the AllStar Game out of Georgia because of what's going on, and moving it to Coors Field. Okay, so actually that's like going from a red state to blue state. But it seems to me there's another thing. If we look at, going back to Mickey Mantle, Mickey Mantle, there was a point where Mickey Mantle said, and it was just when it was like 2 All-Star games. Mickey Mantle said, I don't want to go to the All-Star game. I go away and I strike out on 3 pitches. That's it, right? So we don't want to go to. If you look at this past week, the home run derby is getting almost surpassed the All-Star game. Mm. And so what happened, if you have to move, and it's money you make up because of the pandemic, I'm moving it to Coors Field. I'm moving it to Coors Field because I'm curious what would happen with a home run derby at Coors Field. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what happens is that it looks nice, but why are they making these decisions? Now, early in our conversation, you mentioned McGuire and Sosa and the deal with the steroid. Look at how we look at the steroid era, the same way we might want to look at the packaging of Babe Ruth after the Black Sox scandal. Mm-hmm. It was the owners who decided, how do we bring the fans back? Well, if I have to build a ballpark, I'm going to make it nice for the home run. Mm-hmm. Okay, now that's owners on steroids. They're cheating. Okay, no different than we're the ground crew, and we want to slow down the Padres, right? And we just water the field and make it really muddy. Okay, but look at all these other things, which someone say, well, is that fair? Is that honest? No. Somebody's looking at the money that's being made. We're going to move the All-Star. We're happy that we have a person who is Japanese, who is dominating right now, because we still have that market if we're going to come back.
Yeah, very much. Well, they need the market, and baseball is such an international game. But boy, those owners, they're an interesting group. But it's funny, you bring up Coors Field, and when they made the announcement, they were shifting it, and I agreed. Get it out of Atlanta. And but as soon as they said Coors Field, I went, oh, this is going to be interesting. And I had.
Are you thinking All-Star Game, or are you thinking home run derby?
Yeah, I'm surprised they just don't make Coors Field the permanent site for the home run derby.
I bet you somebody will come up with this. You can almost say it's for travel. It's in the middle.
Yeah, very much. But it's funny, we're back to baseball. And certainly because of ownership, I don't see these cats, embracing, there's some social upheaval or change out there. I think we'll embrace it. No, they're running from it. The ones I knew all the time. But, I'm thinking now back to 68, mm-hmm. Which could be the last time we were this divided in a way. And we were just so, and I don't use this word a lot, but blessed to really have the St. Louis Cardinals and the Detroit Tigers be the 2 teams that met in the World Series. Because I think they reminded us, here, especially with the Cardinals, Black, white, Latino, and it reminded us how good we can be when we're all, in it together, so to speak. And those were 2 just exceptional teams, not so much on the field, but the way they just approach things. I mean, the Cardinals, were amazing, and the Tigers were, very much kind of embracing celebrity kind of.
But I think there's something else there, Jim, is mm-hmm. that we can talk all day long about Yankees, New York and Boston. But we know that when we're dealing with baseball, it is St. Louis. Mm-hmm. It's Stan the Man. It's St. Louis, where it is. If you go back in the history of it, it's St. Louis. And then if you deal with Detroit, which is like a working class city, when we think of baseball and workers, the history of it, that's those teams play the way the people, live their lives. You could talk about the importance of baseball and the importance of Motown.
Yeah, very much. And I don't think with both of those teams in their own way, one of the faults I have with a great many professional athletes these days is the money's gotten so big. Okay, I don't begrudge the money, but I begrudge when you're not a part of my community. When you live up at the end of some gated cul-de-sac or something like that. And when I was doing Summer of '68, one of the most interesting times I had was I was interviewing Willie Horton, who is the left fielder on that great Tiger team. Right. And out at his house, and he still works, he's like an advisor to the Tigers or something. He said, well, come on, we'll go on into the stadium. There's a game, you ride with me. And so I'm riding in with him, and we're heading toward Comerica Park, and we're only maybe 3-4 blocks away on Woodward Avenue. And all of a sudden he goes, oh, okay, hang on. Whoop. And he goes into a parking garage. And I'm going, Willie, I know you got to have a parking spot. I look at the list of officers and people here. You're right up near the top. And he's like, oh yeah, of course I do. But we're going to park here today. And I'm going, okay. And we're walking now Woodward Avenue toward the ballpark, only a couple blocks. He knew everybody. He knew the store owners. He knew the bum on the street. He knew whatever. And we're doing this. And finally we get to the ballpark and I go, oh, I get it. He goes, yeah, I got to check in with my people,
when you say that, Tim, that's a story that you hear. I think it's in Bill White's book, Uppity, where he talks about what it meant for Black baseball players, especially in the Negro Baseball League, to walk through the community in their uniform to the park. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it was almost a way, where you have the famous boxers, Joe Louis or Sugar Ray Robinson, coming back to the community. When they walk through the streets, people are proud. They want to. They highlight these individuals as being leaders of their community, and they really want to dress like they dress.
And it's showing too that that connection's there. But the connection between the fan and the team and the player. One of the things I begrudge a little bit is we've got a lot of Fairweather fans out there right now. Where they kind of just jump on whatever bandwagon is going. This is regardless of sport, and as one who grew up near Buffalo, suffering with the Bills and stuff.
Oh, come on! Yeah. Somebody can find their helmet if they need to.
I still got the Spurs here somewhere, but this is what you do. You're with your team through thick and thin, and I think one reason it's easier to do that when you see the players at least around a little bit more. I mean, it's funny now, like a kid. My son does this sometimes, and my son's not a kid anymore, but, say he's getting infatuated with somebody like Shawnee, for example, or I don't know, back in the day, Ken Griffey Jr. or Derek Jeter, then he can easily call up the highlights, but it's not like he's any closer in a sense to understanding the story, understanding the narrative, and it's the thread between him and that team isn't any.
Well, let's look at the story that we just saw a few weeks ago, which was very beautiful because it restored something in terms of our game in our country. We saw the Dodgers back at the White House. Mm-hmm. And Kershaw, for example, was very happy to be there, and all the teams, all the players on the team, was there. And what Biden was saying, and it was very good that there was the Dodgers there, because he was saying, okay, this is an organization that has meant a lot, whether it's when they were in Brooklyn or whether we're in Los Angeles, and say, okay, they're helping out with, fighting COVID. They're dealing with opening up facilities for voting. And so you have an organization that if I'm a player, I get it. What I felt at that session at the White House was not just Biden being in front, but the fact that here was Roberts, Black manager, the team that Jackie Robinson, integrated, giving, because he was happy to see Kamala Harris there, the president gets and he gives that little jersey that says 49. But the joy, like we could full circle what we talked about, earlier, about being young and going to the ballpark. Here's Dave Robinson, manager of the world champion Los Angeles Dodgers, and he's like a little boy again, meeting Kamala Harris. And you realize that joy is the joy of baseball. And this is what happened. The joy of going to the White House And you could argue every day about the politics of Donald Trump, but you cannot argue the fact there was a certain sense of cruelty and just bad manners that came with him. So it's not like, okay, abortion, this and that. No, it was just the proper thing to do. I mean, who wants to, you know what, you interview a lot of people. I want to interview the Black people at the White House who said, okay, we got to serve hamburgers. I'm certain that those folks got back, putting their feet up, saying, no, brother, you go take the tray up there. I ain't doing it. Because, you know, to me, that's being really disrespectful.
Very much.
That's being really respectful.
Let's look at our crystal balls here. We got a couple more minutes, and actually, maybe if we got time, I'd love to close with one more poem from you. But we're looking into the future, and I'm doing so a little bit looking in the past. It wasn't that long ago, say, horse racing, boxing, baseball were the three big sports. Now, certainly things are going to shift around and whatever, and of course, boxing has got huge problems right now, have really dropped off. Baseball's still somewhat there. You could argue football's king, but baseball's there. How does baseball stay, you know, in this kind of rarefied air? What keeps them from having the same fate as, say, boxing or horse racing?
Well, I think baseball is going to have to tap in to the Japanese and Korean market. They're going to have to expand. If you look at the sport that is embracing it, keep in mind that when we look at the NBA has a lot of stars from Europe. Okay, so you can see they're also making inroads into Africa. Okay, so you have this international aspect. At the same time, what we will be faced with is the more popularity in terms of soccer, okay, being a real sport, and not being confused with football, but that. And then I think the other thing that when we're looking at, which will probably put some emphasis, some pressure on Major League Baseball, we're looking at the women athletes dominating. So the same way we're talking about Shohei, okay, we can see that women, and then when I'm talking about the Little League, you know, we saw women dominate Little League, but we're talking about maybe there's going to be either, you know, a woman on that field, and if there's, and we keep them in a league of their own, it's going to hold back. But there's going to be some people, some women coming in that's going to change the game.
I totally agree. And I think, you know, as you're saying that, what's running through my mind is obviously it's got to be more inclusive, but it's a plus and a minus. I mean, it's a sword that cuts both ways with baseball. And what I'm meaning by that, I'm flashing back to my mom and such. It's a game that almost has to be handed off person to person. You know, it's not a game where you give a kid a ball, a basketball, and tell him to go down and shoot at the hoop, and he turns into the Steph Curry. I mean, there's enough nuance, there's enough surprise, enough promise that, you know, it's got to be like my grandfather taking me to the game. And I don't think we're doing a great job of it.
Well, right? I tell you what, who we haven't talked about, who I think, and as soon as I say, I think you will see this is who's key. If I go back to the Yankees, I'm dealing with Mel Allen. I'm saying it's going. I'm, you know, how about that? It is a sports announcer. If you look at basketball, NCAA or pro, it is who's calling those games that you say, you know, if you're in the backyard, you know, that's the sports writer, the sports broadcaster, you know, they are the ones that are shaping this narrative. And so if you're a kid and you hit, that's why sports, I mean, the final, you know, Final Four in March Madness, it's who's announcing that last buzzer beater shot. And then all of a sudden you go out and you want to be there.
Yeah, good point. And you were bringing up earlier St. Louis and how that was such a place. Well, it's KMOX, it's Harry Carey, it's all that. And, you know, you could tune in, you know.
Scully out in the thing in LA.
You know, I've got Sirius XM, I listen to all the games, but sometimes I just go, hang on, what game do I have? Because they all sound kind of the same. Right. Whereas in the old days, I knew if I had Jack Brickhouse or if I had Harry Carey or if I had Joe Buck or whatever.
And that carried over to even if you were in the backyard by yourself. Yeah. You were imagining, you know, your field of dreams. You know.
Well, let me tell one more story that I'd love you to have us take us out with a poem, but I'm thinking, you know, again, it's that human connection, which makes the game special, but also it makes it more difficult to do. And for just for several years in the postseason, and this is where things are just serendipity and it's beautiful. I wasn't, I'm covering the playoffs, I'm covering the World Series, and the guy they had me sitting next to for 2 straight years in the auxiliary press box was Roger Angel from the New Yorker. And in fact, it's that song, hey, and he turns to me and goes, do you know what that name of that song is? And I did. It's Rock and Roll Part 2 by Gary Glitter. And I told him that, and I'm written up in his big synopsis thing in the New Yorker like a month or so later. And my young friend told me. I was much younger then. But he tells a great story about how it had to be the Bobby Thompson home run, 59, whatever. And he's watching it on TV. And he goes to call his wife in going, here we go. Something's building up. Here comes the surprise. Here comes the twist. Something's telling me something big is about to happen. And he's trying to bring his wife in. Oh, come on in. I think something about going on here. And she kind of comes in and just, oh, hang on a minute. And she goes out to get something in the kitchen and she does it.
Yeah.
And as he said, she never really became a baseball fan. She missed
that moment,
that opening, that connection. So, and that's why I love talking baseball with you, because the connection is so good. Well, we're kind of coming down the end. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. And you want to ride us out with another?
I'll read it's a short poem. It's in 5 parts, like the fingers. True Confessions of a Baseball. 1. If they would replace my stitches with cornrows, I'm certain I could attract more black pitchers. 2. When you come from a large family, people will toss you back and forth. 3. People keep falling over seats for me. Who needs a rain delay with so much seduction in the air? 4. I tell folks I have to always be handled with gloves. 5. Every time I brush against a man's jersey, he tries to get to first base. And I add some humor into it.
Well, this was great fun. Always
good to see
with you and talking writing, and the connections I think between the two are very paramount for both.
Jim, make sure you're never replaced by a designated hitter.
I don't want to be replaced by a designated writer. That's what I'm worried about. And thanks to 1455. Thanks for putting this on. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. You can reach both of us through our websites or whatever it may be. If you're going, you guys are crazy, you totally forgot about so-and-so or whatever, which we probably did. But anyway, see you later, my friend.
Okay, take care. Many blessings. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.